The two husbands in the mind of Paul. For 2 millennia, New Testament scholarship has labored to compress the letters of Paul into a singular, frictionless theological system. Subsequent church traditions retroactively imposed later dogmas onto the text to harmonize the profound tensions within the Pauline corpus. However, when we strip away centuries of systematic theology and isolate the text, a more radical reality emerges. Paul does not describe a smooth transition within a single divine household. Instead, he describes a sharp border crisis between two active cosmic jurisdictions. By examining the precise legal mechanics of Romans chapter 7 verses 1 to 4, this thesis exposes a universe managed by two husbands. Crucially, this dualism is not born of Gnostic hatred for the material world. It is also not a Marcionite rejection of the Old Testament God. To the contrary, Paul views the first husband and his law as perfect and holy. The tragedy of the Pauline universe is a functional jurisdictional mismatch. The unyielding perfection of the first husband's contract inevitably crushes the fragile human flesh. This legal reality forces the human to stage a proxy suicide in order to marry an entirely separate new master. To uncover the raw internal logic of Paul's mind, this project employs a strict methodology of textual isolation. It is impossible to evaluate Paul's legal frameworks objectively while simultaneously relying on subsequent historical or theological synthesis. Therefore, this study deliberately mutes three distinct layers of interpretative influence. Number one, the Lucan narrative harmony. We will exclude the book of Acts entirely. Luke's narrative project operates with its own specific agenda of historical reconciliation. It seeks to smooth over the fierce ideological battle that Paul himself draws in his letters. Number two, later church councils and dogma. We will not use 4th century Trinitarian formulas, Nicene frameworks, or medieval sacramental definitions to translate Paul's vocabulary. Applying subsequent systematic categories to Paul retroactively fixes contradictions that he left raw. Number three, the patristic and Reformation heresy templates. We will evaluate Paul's ideas based on internal consistency rather than analyzing them through the lens of ancient polemics like Marcionism or later frameworks like Augustinism. By restricting our archives strictly to the undisputed Pauline epistles, which are Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon, we treat these documents as self-contained legal ledger. We analyze how Paul defines his own terms based entirely on how he uses them in context. The structural blueprint of this entire thesis rests upon a literal, unharmonized reading of Paul's marriage analogy in Romans chapter 7, verse 1 to 4. Paul begins by stating a universal unyielding legal axiom. He states, "Do you not know brothers and sisters, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has authority over a person only as long as the person lives. For example, by law, a married woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law of that marriage. The mechanics of the opening rule are clear. An unbreakable, lifelong contract requires the death of the husband for the wife to be legally liberated. However, in verse 4, Paul introduces a sudden and massive structural subversion. He says, "Likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him who has been raised from the dead." Notice the immediate logical glitch. Paul does not say that the first husband died. He says that you, the wife, died. Because the first husband, Yahweh in this case, and his law, or Torah, is an immortal constant who does not die, the contract cannot be voided from the top down. The household of the first husband remains fully open, active, and legally binding for those who remain alive within it. Now, to escape this permanent authority, the human must commit a form of institutional proxy suicide. By dying to the law through the body of Christ, the believer's old legal identity is completely erased. The resurrected human emerges as a brand new entity, completely invisible to the first husband's tracking system. This legal erasure allows them to slip out the back door of the old estate and enter an exclusive contract with the second husband, which is Jesus. Now, this metaphor demands the existence of two distinct coexisting seats of cosmic power. You cannot have a wife who is legally dead to a husband while her non-believing kinsmen are still actively bound to that exact same husband, unless that husband is a separate entity running a distinct jurisdiction. Because this thesis identifies a dual master cosmos in Paul's letters, it will inevitably evoke comparisons to early Christian dualisms, specifically Marcionism and Gnosticism. It is critical to establish a firm boundary line against these heresies at the outset. Marcion of Sinope famously argued that the creator God of the Hebrew Scriptures was an inferior, ignorant, and inherently harsh entity who stood in direct opposition of the supreme, loving God revealed by Jesus. Similarly, various Gnostic systems posited that the physical world was a mistake, a dense, evil prison cell constructed by a lesser deity known as the Demiurge. Within the Gnostic framework, the physical body and material world are inherently wicked, and salvation requires escaping physical matter altogether. Paul's internal logic rejects this metaphysical dualism on two foundational fronts. Number one, the integrity of the first husband. Paul never demonizes the first husband or his law. In Romans 7:12, he writes explicitly, saying, "So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and just and good." To Paul, the first husband is not an evil or ignorant tyrant. He is a perfectly righteous judge. The problem is not that his rules are bad, but that his rules are too perfect. This standard is unyielding. leaving no room for human failure. Unlike the Gnostics, Paul does not advocate for the destruction or abandonment of material creation. In Romans 8, he explicitly notes that the physical creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay. Furthermore, his view of salvation requires the physical resurrection of the body. He says, "He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to our mortal bodies through his Spirit who lives in you." That is Romans chapter 8, verse 11. Therefore, the dualism present in the mind of Paul is not cosmological or material, but strictly juridical and functional. Paul does not hate the physical world. He recognizes a fatal operational mismatch between a holy, unyielding law and weak human flesh. To understand this operational mismatch, we must define Paul's concept of the flesh, sarx, without falling into Gnostic definitions. For Paul, the flesh is not inherently evil. Rather, it represents human frailty, mortality, and the innate human capacity for rule breaking. The first husband's law acts upon human flesh like a magnet. Because the flesh is weak, it cannot live up to the holy standards of the contract. Paradoxically, the presence of the perfect commandment actually triggers and provokes forbidden desires within the human flesh. He says in Romans chapter 7, verse 8, "For sin, seizing the opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness." Thus, the formula of the first husband's household is entirely predictable. Holy law plus weak flesh equals legal condemnation and death. The first household is a metabolic dead end. It is not an evil prison, but a perfectly legal courtroom where humanity is trapped under a valid sentence of death. The only solution is total shift in cosmic allegiance. The human cannot wait for the first husband to change his rules or die. The human must use Jesus as a legal escape hatch, faking their own death, so to speak, to migrate permanently into the parallel jurisdiction of the second husband, where life is governed by the Spirit rather than written codes.